trying to say life is like a record, so just let it play. Best Day Ever Media. Song by Dan the Lost Boy.
All right, guys, we are back, and we're going to be talking about one of my favorite subject matters, board games. So first things first, if when you hear board games and you immediately cringe, or you're like, oh, I hate board games, I hate Monopoly, I hate Risk, I hate Sorry. One, you haven't been exposed to good board games. Although I don't actually mind Monopoly or Risk. They're probably the best of like the traditional board games, in my opinion, but they pale in comparison to modern day, what are often referred to as like Euro games or strategic games. There's a huge industry around this and tons of fun and fascinating games. But before we get into my different recommendations, and I'm going to go through like, my favorite games. I'm going to share with you guys the best beginner board games if you're kind of new to the idea. I'd love to just share my general thoughts on board games and why I became such a fan of them. So again, always enjoyed Monopoly, even as a kid, and Risk as soon as I discovered it. I can remember taking my Risk board game into university, my first year in living in res, and like we played Risk as a floor, right? So like five guys would get together from the floor. I forget I think you can have six players in Risk. And we'd play there. I can remember introducing it to probably like a dozen people on my floor. And one night in particular, there was a very heated game of Risk going on. And two guys that were literally like thick as thieves, they were BFFs forever, had a huge blowout literally because of Risk, because one backstabbed the other. And essentially he was like, this is going to date me, but it's like, I want my CDs back. I want my DVDs back. You're never allowed in my room again. I can't trust you. Obviously, that's an extreme version of the sort of fun you can have when it comes to board games. But what really drew me into board games was as I entered my mid 20s and late 20s, like you go from like house parties where the goal is just kind of get blackout drunk or go to clubs or whatever, to, at least for me, like wanting something a little bit more, right? Like maybe stimulating my brain a little bit, forcing myself to think while still getting intoxicated. And that's where board games came in and were just the perfect fit. In my probably early mid 20s, friends of mine were just addicted to Settlers of Catan. And we'll get to Settlers of Catan further in a second. But I can remember going over to their house, partying and stuff, and they'd usually be playing Settlers, but they'd always like start the game before I got there because I was the only, like one of the only ones coming that wasn't living there or living close by. And so eventually I like weaseled my way and got there early and was able to play Catan. And from the first game I played, I was just addicted. I was obsessed with it and went on. I've literally probably played hundreds, if not like thousands, maybe, of games of Settlers at this point in time. And what I really enjoy is, most strategy games, unless you're getting like really deep into, intense strategy games. And I'll share like two of the most intense games that I've only like on a couple occasions been able to bring together a big enough group and convince enough people to play with me. And I'll tell you all about those games in a little bit. But with most of these games, particularly the games I'm going to share with you, they're the introduction to Euro games or strategy board games. Once you learn the basic rules, and most of them are relatively simple, you can still like hang out with your friends. You can still have lively conversations. You can still get intoxicated, whatever your jam happens to be. But it's still also a little stimulating. And it even just like kind of gives you something to talk about rather than just like, hey, how was your week? How was your week? Da, 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 da. So again, you guys know I hate small talk. I love big talk. But if we're not going to only have big talk, then I'd rather distract myself with a board game than simply a TV show or just trying to get blackout drunk as fast as possible. So I'm going to pull up here. This is from our Substack. Again, it's completely free. Go over and join it. You can hit the like button. I'm usually the only one hitting the like button these days, but if you hit it too, that'll make my day. But board games, spoiler alert, Matt's a huge board game nerd. So first, I want to share with you guys some of my favorite resources when it comes to board games, and then we'll get into recommendations. So first things first, Board Game Geek. I don't think there's a more comprehensive website in regards to board games than Board Game Geek. BGG's been around forever, very thorough. I'm not active really anymore in the board game scene other than just playing with friends occasionally, but there was a time when I spent a lot of time here researching board games, getting an understanding of what games were best for me, what games would be funnest for my group to play. If you want to learn everything board game related, if you want to learn about a game or see all the components, understand the gameplay before buying it, this is the go-to resource in my humble opinion. Next, and I forgot to pull this up here, but let's quickly pull it up, is I think it's Games and Sundry. Or maybe actually, did the link work here? Yeah. So Games and Sundry. This is Will Wheaton's. I don't know if Will Wheaton's it, but like 5-10 years ago he was. Jeez, maybe has it been 10 years? How long has this been around? 2011. Jeez, yeah, it's been 10 years. But back in, I want to say, like the mid teens and late teens of 21st century, he was absolutely crushing it with his gameplay. He'd bring in his friends and like micro influencers and stuff like that to play board games. It was really fun because again, this allowed you to understand or see a game, see how it's played, see how people enjoy the level of strategy or the level of complexity. Just going to look here quickly at like the most popular ones, but like yeah, like I remember watching this Munchkin, Small World, pretty much any of these ones with the thumbnails. These are the best in my opinion. The old school thumbnails, like yeah, 10 years ago. God, how the time flies. Uh, but anyways, really encourage you guys check it out, Geek and Sundry, if you want to watch gameplay and stuff like that. There's probably a whole host of channels now that do this thing, but back in the day in 2011 when I first started watching, this was top tier. And then finally, there's also, I think originally I remember this as a podcast and then it became a website and a YouTube channel. But the Dice Tower is another fantastic resource. Really encourage you guys to jump over there and check it out. But those are like the three best board game resources to the best of my knowledge. But like I said, been kind of out of the scene for a little. Jump in the chat, jump in the Telegram, or you can leave a comment on this Substack post because, hey, you don't even need to actually pay to join the Substack or leave a comment. So right now, no paywall. Here's a little photo of Settlers of Catan, one of my favorite all-time games. And one of the reasons Settlers, in my opinion, is like top tier when it comes to board games is it's got the perfect balance, in my opinion, of strategy and luck. And it can be really hard for a lot of games to balance that appropriately. It's sometimes fun when a game has almost no luck elements to it. And I'll get into a couple game recommendations that essentially involve no luck. But there's also games that have far too much luck. And it can be very frustrating if you actually want to try to win, right? Or if you want to try and beat your friends at games purely luck. So, like, you know, uh, this game isn't purely luck, but like think of Yahtzee, right? It's the luck of the dice for the vast majority. There's a tiny little bit of strategy you can apply in regards to what you decide to do based upon your first rolls and what scores you kind of take for in the first couple rounds. But outside of mainly the luck of the dice, there's not a lot you can do to put yourself in a better position when it comes to Yahtzee. But my recommendation for beginner board games, and I would encourage you guys, if you're looking to get into board games, just buy one or two of these base games. You don't need to buy a bunch of expansions in order to get the full fun out of the game. Um, I used to call this the Holy Trinity, but I've added King of Tokyo to it subsequently. But I think Settlers of Catan, Carcassonne, King of Tokyo, and Ticket to Ride. Those are like the four best board games possible, in my opinion. Some of these are like so simple. Actually, all of them technically are so simple that you could probably teach them to an 8-year-old or a 10-year-old, and they're going to get the fundamentals. They might not be able to out strategize you in regards to it, but they'll be able to follow along with the rules. They're not terribly complex. I would say Ticket to Ride and King of Tokyo are probably the best ones if you're particularly looking to introduce younger players to strategy board games. And Carcassonne and Settlers, I think, are fantastic for anyone that kind of enjoys at least aspects of Monopoly or enjoys aspects of Risk, but want to sink their teeth into something that's just a little bit more strategy oriented. So Settlers of Catan, that's the photo here. Definitely just like flat out my favorite game of all time, the board game I played the most games of. Carcassonne is way underrated in my opinion. So Settlers of Catan, if I had to describe it, it's like a kind of like a city building thing. There's no direct conflict, and actually, other than King of Tokyo, there's no direct conflict in any of these games. So if you're concerned about like destroying the other person or beating them up or making them feel bad, that's really not going to be the case, at least for three of these games. The King of Tokyo, there's a little bit more direct conflict where you're like fighting each other. But we'll also get into a handful of games where it's literally co-op games. So like it's cooperative where it's you guys versus the board game. rather than like having to team up against each other. So again, there's a board game for every type of person these days. Settlers of Catan, though, highly recommend. Carcassonne, really fun, like tile laying game that when you first start to play it, you'll think you've got the strategy, and then you'll start to learn, like, oh shit, like there's levels to this stuff. So again, I love it. All these games like have um, uh, total replay value. Like they don't diminish over time. In fact, you'll just learn more and more nuances to it, despite the fact, as I said, that the rules are very simple and easy to get into. King of Tokyo, again, probably my number one recommendation for younger players. Essentially, in King of Tokyo, what you're doing is, well, I guess I should explain what each of them are. Settlers of Catan, you're literally settling an island, you're building up your resources and economy. So if you love like basic, turn-based strategy games, Settlers of Catan, you're going to feel right at home. Carcassonne, and again, Settlers of Catan, think of it as like a really watered down version of the game Civilization without tech trees and stuff like that. Carcassonne is essentially based upon, I think it was a region or a castle in France, if I'm not mistaken. But essentially, you're laying down tiles, claiming tiles with your meeples, which are like little people. And essentially, you're trying to score the most number of points. Same with Settlers of Catan, it's a points game. King of Tokyo, essentially you're a monster attacking Tokyo, right? So think like Godzilla or whatever all the names are to the Godzilla franchise of monsters. And essentially there usually can only be one or two kings of Tokyo, depending on whether you're playing with 4 or 6 players, if I remember correctly. But it is more confrontational. So if you really don't want people like rolling dice against each other and trying to like beat up the other guy, King of Tokyo may not be for you, but I think it's great for kids. Ticket to Ride is essentially a I don't know what the term for it would be, but it's kind of like a card playing game where what you're trying to do is build rail lines. So, if you're a big fan of like railroad simulators or things like this is the most watered down version of a railroad simulator that you're likely to find. Again, very simple rules, but there are levels of complexity to the strategy. So, if you're playing these games with all new beginners, you guys will have fun, easily be able to understand the rules. But if you're playing with if you want advanced, tough strategies, all you need to do is play against better players, right? More experienced players. And you'll find that there's lots of gameplay value out of all these games, indefinitely, in my opinion. Although I'd say Settlers and Carcassonne probably best bang for the buck in regards to replayability. I've never got sick of either of those games. But if you want to get a little bit more into intermediate strategy board games, if you've already had your fill of Settlers of Catan, Carcassonne, King of Tokyo, and Ticket to Ride, this is a handful of some of my favorite games that are what I'm going to call intermediate. So Seven Wonders, it's kind of like a card playing, deck building sort of game. And the goal is to essentially like build wonders, score points. Again, relatively simple, but there's as you start to understand the mechanics of like how to proactively kind of block your competition, stuff like that, it'll allow for like a greater understanding of more in-depth strategy. Pandemic, this is one of those cooperative games where it's literally you guys versus the board game. Pandemic was, I think, the first cooperative board game I ever played. My gaming group absolutely fell in love with it, and essentially what you're trying to do is stop a world pandemic. I mean, it's too bad that some of our political leaders didn't play it in advance. Maybe we'd be in a better spot today. Dominion. This is another like deck building game. A little bit more like Magic the Gathering, if you're familiar with that. But unlike Magic the Gathering, you're not going to have to spend all your money on expensive booster packs to try and outbeat the competition. You can just buy this box game and that's that. You're not going to have to constantly chase the new, more powerful cards and try and spend your way to success. The Resistance. So this is a game where essentially there's traders amongst you and you're trying to figure out who the traders are. So some of your fellow game players will be traders. This is a whole genre of games at this point in time. Avalon, there's one with like dwarves and mining. I can't think of it right now, but it's literally over there on my shelf of board games. But the Resistance is more of like a party game. So if you guys like want to be a little bit more fun, if you want to get to yell at other people or theorize about how they're the bad guy or evil, if you enjoy like tricking people, the Resistance is going to be absolutely up your alley. Really encourage. Saboteur would be another game that maybe you're more familiar with. And again, love playing the Resistance. And this is a game where like there is levels to the strategy. I remember I joined a gaming group in London, Ontario at a local board game a store where essentially I think it was like every Monday people would go, and there'd be dozens of us there, and there's this one like group or clique of people that played the Resistance, and like it just if you were new to the game, you couldn't even like there was no way you could win because they understood they mainly played Avalon, which is just kind of a version of the Resistance, but like they understood every intricacies and like they understood the double cross and the backstab and all that. So again, most of these games have a lot of replayability as you personally evolve and your group of game players evolve in regards to understanding the nuances of the strategy. Betrayal at House on the Hill. This is such a fun game. It starts off as a cooperative game, but then eventually evolves into like a one versus many game. And again, so much fun. Really encourage you guys. If you've ever seen the movie Cabin in the Woods, that's essentially what this game is. Betrayal at House on the Hill, where like there's essentially 50 different scenarios, and it gives so much different replayability to the game because of those. You can buy expansions that give you more scenarios to play out, but it's just a lot of fun. It's weird. Now, this game getting a little bit more complex. You're going to be like reading pages in order to fully understand the game, where the rest of the games above, they're not that level of complexity. So if you hate reading, if you hate complexity in board games, Betrayal at House on the Hill is probably starting to get outside the scope of games that you're going to like. Evolution. This is a game where you start off like with like basic mammal creatures and you add on traits to them. This game I originally backed on Kickstarter. Absolute huge fanboy of Evolution. There's been a couple expansions that really add levels of complexity as well. And yeah, it there's enough strategy here that it can take a while to really get your sea legs in regards to Evolution. A little bit more reading when it comes to the rules as well. Then Dead Panic. Really love Dead Panic. There's a bunch of different zombie oriented board games, so Dead Panic may not be your favorite, but it was one of my favorites. Also, one of the few ones that I had. I think Dead of Winter is another great one that we used to play as well. But in Dead Panic, essentially, you and your team, and if I remember correctly, it starts out again as cooperative, where it's you guys versus everyone else usually. Although there's different ways you can kind of play with the scenarios, but I think eventually one of you or multiples of you can end up becoming the zombies and bad guys. But essentially, what it is you and your team are locked in a cabin and you're trying to fight off crazy zombie hordes. And I forget whether you're trying to collect items in order to do something, but eventually what you're going to do is like try and call a vehicle to come rescue you and escape. It's a lot of fun, and again, more like Betrayal at House on the Hill. You're gonna have to read some shit, so if that's not up your alley, it may not be the best game to get into from an intermediate standpoint. But now let's get into like rich strategy games. Puerto Rico, probably my favorite rich strategy game. This is a game where there's no dice. There's technically no luck other than how other players play. So again, you can sometimes get like weird random situations where people chase weird strategies, and that can impact your ability. But essentially, you're starting a colony in Puerto Rico, and you're trying to build up the most robust economy and score the most points. This is the game that we'd almost always play, at least one game of it with like my group of like intense board game friends. So again, highly recommend you guys check out Puerto Rico if you're looking to sink your teeth into a deeper strategy game. Then there's Caverna. Again, these are getting into like big complex games. You're probably going to spend at least an hour and a half, 2 hours playing Caverna at this point in time, where most of the other games I've shared with you up until this point, I guess that would have been useful. My beginner and introductory games here, these will all take an hour or less usually. Settlers of Catan, if you've got like really good people playing, it sometimes will drag out. Most of these games here are going to be an hour-ish. Betrayal at House on the Hill, Dead Panic, Evolution. You're starting to get more into like an hour and a half sort of territory, maybe even sometimes bumping up to 2 hours with Betrayal at House on the Hill in particular. Puerto Rico, probably an hour and change. Caverna, hours. So you're committed to this. And Lords of Waterdeep, again, we're talking hours there in regards to the games. There's a lot more reading and nuances to it. There's a lot of different like buildings and strategy types, and it can take multiple gameplays before you even fully understand how the game fully works. But if you want to go full blown game nerd, this is the game for you, in my humble opinion. Also, just let me know, what is your favorite board game? So jump in the comments section, whether you're watching this live or on the replays. join the Telegram chat and let me know what are your favorite board games, because I'm always looking for fun recommendations. And if Sorry is your favorite board game, I honestly feel sorry for you because you don't know good board games. But let's get into the last category here. And so these are Matt's favorite crazy in-depth strategy board games that almost no one is crazy enough to say yes to. So Civilization. Yeah, if you're thinking about the video game, that's essentially what this is, but in board game form. So, like, if you don't like having to read pages of rules, break out calculators, we played this maybe 3-4 times max in my entire life, and I think the shortest we never like finished a game, but probably the shortest game we ever had was 3 or 4 hours. And then the longest game probably was like 8 or 10 hours. So again, like if you want to go full blown nerd, this is it. And I just realized there's one game I forgot to list on here that I'm going to get to next is Firefly. So if you love Firefly, the Josh Whedon TV series, or Serenity, I think was the movie that came out after it. Literally, again, Firefly is like a 2 to 4 hour board game. You build your own ship, you go and run missions, you're trying to like level up, that stuff, score the most points, if I remember correctly. We only played that game a couple times too, because again, it can be hard sometimes to find like-minded individuals that want to sometimes spend a day learning the rules to then spend the next day playing the game. And then there's Diplomacy. Diplomacy is this really unique game. It's an old game too, which is kind of surprising. And there's not a ton of rules, but there's a lot negotiations. And so essentially, if I remember correctly, I think it's the start of World War One, and you take over one of the major powers in World War One, and your goal is to like take over the world or defeat your enemies. And it's not as like the conflict aspect of it isn't really as significant as the diplomacy, hence the name, or the negotiations. And so it's all about like backstab and subterfuge and tricking people and double crosses. Again, if you enjoy that sort of thing, think of Diplomacy as like Risk plus the Resistance or Avalon. That's probably the easiest way I could describe it. I remember I mentioned at that board game meetup that I used to go to way back in the day. That would have been like in 2015, 2016. I mentioned to one of the girls there that I owned Diplomacy, but never found like 6 people crazy enough to play it with me. And they had all wanted to play it, but no one had the board game. So I brought it like the following week and we set up the game. I think we played for like 2 hours. We barely even got into the game because, again, there's so many complexities and it's a slow paced game for a lot of it. And one guy walking by, an older game board nerd, was like, "You guys are playing Diplomacy?" And we're like, "Yeah, we're so excited. Da, da, da." And he's like, "You must really hate each other because you're definitely not going to like each other after this." So again, not all these games, especially when we get into the deeper strategy games, are going to be for everyone. But as I mentioned, I'm a huge board game nerd. I just want to spend a little bit of time sharing with you guys one of my favorite hobbies, because that's what these Thursday shows are all about. Recently, I introduced Adam and Christina, so Adam Martin, who's my usual co-host, to the show, to a Civilization, to Settlers of Catan. They absolutely loved it. They've been playing it nonstop. They're about to come back up here to the Citadel. I've got a handful of games I'm going to introduce them to. I think probably Carcassonne will be the next one that I get them playing, but I hope to get them into some of the intermediate games. Maybe we'll even try one of the more in-depth strategy games as well. But anyways, that's it for this Hobbies Day. Again, appreciate you guys watching, hanging out with me. If you enjoy these Wednesdays, let us know in the comment section. Smash the like button, all that good stuff. Appreciate you guys hanging out with me. I hope you have the best day ever. And honestly, I think getting a small group of friends together and playing board games is a recipe for having the best day ever. All right, that's it, guys. I appreciate you. I'll be back tomorrow with another 24-hour news cycle. Have a great day.
They say life is what you make it. So what happens if you actually try? What if you actually tried to get your mind right? What if you actually tried to live the high life? What if you happen to die cause life is finite? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever?